We begin the day with a new naval blockade around the Strait of Hormuz. After peace talks between the U.S. and Iran ended without a breakthrough over the weekend, President Trump announced that the U.S. would impose its own blockade on the vital shipping route. Now, since then, conflicting information has come out of the U.S., but the latest reports say that the blockade will be enforced in the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea to the east of the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. military said that it would prevent ships entering and leaving Iranian ports. Now, around 20% of the world's oil supplies passed through the strait before the U.S. and Israel started the war with Iran. While Tehran has effectively closed the strait to international shipping in retaliation, it has managed to export millions of barrels of its own oil. And to look at what the latest developments around the Strait of Hormuz could mean for global oil prices, I'm joined now by Rory Johnston. He's an oil market researcher and founder of CommodityContext.com. Rory, it's good to have you with us. Let's talk about Brent crude prices. We know that they've shot back up over $100 a barrel after sinking last week on the news of this ceasefire deal between the U.S. and Iran. What do you think? How high could prices go if no oil passes this new U.S. blockade in the next coming weeks?
Yeah, I mean, oil prices even above $100 a barrel on the prompt Brent futures price are still, in my mind, far too low for the volume of oil we've already lost from the market, let alone the upside risk of how much additional oil we could lose should this war escalate further. With Brent right now for prompt futures over $100, we're looking at dated Brent, the kind of more spot price, at more like $125, $130 a barrel, and physical delivered premia on those are over $20 on top of that, so over $150. So the oil market is screaming out for additional supply. And as long as Hormuz remains closed, that supply is not coming. Right now, we have roughly 13 million barrels a day, or roughly 13% of global supplies, locked in and shut in the Gulf because of this lack of export capacity with Hormuz closed. And now with the United States blockading it further and preventing Iranian flows, which ironically have actually remained kind of part of the market supply mix this entire war thus far. Very bizarrely, you wouldn't have expected that in hindsight. But that would raise that 13 million to more like 15 million barrels a day. So I can appreciate why the United States is blocking Iran's oil exports in this context, but it does make a currently terrible situation even worse.
So if I've done my math right, you're saying then about 7% of the oil, the world's oil that goes through the Strait of Hormuz has been getting out, with the conditions being the way that they have been for the last few weeks. Do we know where that oil has been going?
Yeah, so of that initial 20 million barrels a day, roughly, that normally transits the Strait of Hormuz when it's not closed, roughly 7 million barrels has been rerouted. Most of that has come through the Saudi East-West pipeline, which dumps out the about roughly 5+ million barrels a day of diverted flows from the Gulf into the Red Sea. And then on top of that, you also had roughly 1.5 to 2 million barrels a day of Iranian crude that continued to transit the strait prior to this blockade. Most of those barrels have all been ending up in Asia, which is the the predominant destination for most Middle Eastern exports, before the war. And that's where these are going to continue going, right? Because right now, that's where the greatest scarcity is for these barrels, is in Asia.
If the U.S. succeeds in blocking Iranian oil exports, who do you think is likely to feel the most economic pain here? Is it going to be Asia?
I mean, China specifically, the vast majority of Iran's oil exports have been going to China historically, although given the recent U.S. Treasury easing of sanctions on Iran's oil exports, again, another part of this that's bizarre in the context, they actually removed sanctions from Iran's floating storage to better facilitate oil supply in the near term. So, for instance, India had actually purchased its first barrels of Iranian crude since roughly 2018 or 2019, when the Trump administration first scuttled the JCPOA. So I would say that in general, it's going to be China, but also a little bit India. But more broadly, it's just the fact that these are 2 million barrels a day of supply that had existed in this already Hormuz-starved market. And now those barrels are getting kind of ripped out of the supply mix. So again, an exceptionally tight scenario in the global oil market that's been made incrementally that much tighter.
I understand, though, that China does have large oil reserves. I mean, give me a timeline here. How long will it be before they have to tap into those reserves, and when would those reserves begin to run out?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yeah, China has, and over the last couple of years, one of the main things we've been talking about the oil market is the voracious demand of Chinese purchases for their SPR specifically, and they've built up their strategic petroleum reserve, I should say. They've built up over 1 billion barrels of oil ready for this. Now, at the time, a lot of people had been thinking, was this, part of some kind of preemptive stock building to prepare for, say, an invasion of Taiwan? That was the overarching kind of concern at the moment, or at that time. Now it seems very kind of prescient in hindsight that, yeah, absolutely, China is a core depender of Middle Eastern flows through Hormuz, and this is always a risk. Part of the reason that China has electrified its transport so rapidly, part of the reason that, by most kind of counts, China's leading the energy transition in terms of incremental renewables added or electrification driven, that isn't generally because of environmental concerns. It's largely because of these geostrategic concerns of this outsized dependence on imported oil and gas supplies. That's the bigger reason. And I think that looks very important in hindsight. As to your question of how long it'll take them to actually tap into those reserves, it's hard to say. They have not been tapping into them as quickly as we would have expected. And part of that could be that Beijing doesn't want to ease up the pressure on the global oil market and kind of make it easier for the White House, given that the only real way the White House and Trump is going to pull back from this war and make the needed concessions to reopen the strait is given market pressure largely from the oil market.
Yeah, and let me pick up on the United States. The president has said that the U.S. is the world's biggest oil producer, and Trump says when oil prices go up, we make a lot of money. Can you maybe flesh that out for us a little bit, Rory? I mean, who are the we that Trump is talking about?
So President Trump is correct when he says the United States is now the world's largest producer of oil and gas. And I would say generally, I'm up in Toronto here in Canada, North America broadly is now the most energy secure kind of, import or consuming region on the planet. Again, increasingly a producing and exporting region. That said, to your question, it's a distributional question at this stage. The people that are going to make the most money from these gangbuster prices for oil and gas and this coming surge of U.S. oil and gas exports are going to be producers and owners of those equities, largely in Texas and New Mexico and Louisiana. But in terms of who's going to pay the price, it's going to be all Americans, particularly those at the coasts that are most exposed to global competitive pressures. Arguably right now, the single cheapest and most energy secure, motorist is actually going to be in the mid-continent of North America, where you don't have those same competitive pressures. But if you're in New York, LA, or Houston, you are going to be facing the same pricing pressure as the rest of the world, because even if you have a barrel, someone else is going to want it more and they're going to pay a higher price.
Rory Johnston, good to have you on the show. Good to get your insights. We appreciate it. Thank you.